Welcome to the Legal Canvas, the estate law podcast for creative minds. I'm your host, Karen Kepler, an estate and trust attorney with extensive experience representing artists, collectors, and foundations. Join me each month as I welcome guests from across various creative industries to discuss the intersection of estate planning, taxes, and the arts. Okay, let's create. Welcome to the Legal Canvas, where we explore the intersection of law and the creative arts. I'm your host, Karen Kepler, a trust and estates attorney with Offutt Kerman, where my practice includes estate planning and administration, with an emphasis on creators and collectors of all types of creative pursuits, including visual, performing, literary, applied, and digital art. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Robert Weinstein and Michael Darling, two of the co-founders of Museum Exchange, the first digital platform for art donations. We'll be discussing the origins of Museum Exchange, as well as how it enables the donation of works of art to institutions across North America. Robert and Michael, welcome to the Legal Canvas.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Welcome. Robert, let's start with you. What led you to create Museum Exchange?
Thanks, Karen. We created Museum Exchange about 5 years ago. I had begun my career in the museum sector as a junior curator at a number of museums, including the Archive of Ontario and the Whitney Museum. We recognized that philanthropy is very important to cultural institutions, and it was challenging and resource intensive in its current system. So we set out to build a new platform to bring technology to that sector and innovate in the space.
What type of challenges did you see?
So there was 4 main challenges in the philanthropy sector. First, with the change, it hadn't changed in the 19th century. So museums were started in the U.S. in the 19th century and really relied on private patronage. And what that resulted in was a local, independent on personal relationships, slow and cumbersome process. And then the other thing that we're seeing was that it concentrated assets in the largest and wealthiest cities and tended to underrepresent minority and marginalized artists. So that those 4 factors together led us to believe that there could be a better system in place using technology to bring connectivity to institutions.
And at a certain point, you met your other 2 co-founders, and one of them is here with us today. Michael, you joined Museum Exchange in 2021. Tell us about your journey.
Yeah, so I spent over 20 years as a museum curator. First full-time job at the Museum of Contemporary Art Los Angeles, and then I went to Seattle to lead their modern and contemporary department, the Seattle Art Museum, and then went to the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago to become chief curator, where I spent 10 years before Robert came knocking at the door with this idea for Museum Exchange. And one of the reasons why it resonated with me, because sitting in the chair as a chief curator, or even beforehand, I would often have people come to me offering gifts of art. And if they weren't right for that particular museum, and of course, I was trying to be quite selective, thinking about storage costs and how regularly we would show those objects, not to mention even just thinking about how a museum can be an imprimatur of arrival for a career and not wanting to jump on the bandwagon with every kind of hot artist that comes along. So seeing that role as a little bit of an arbiter in a way. But I would often, when I would turn people down and say, no, sorry, this isn't right for us, I would often have another museum in mind or say, why don't you try this place? Why don't you try this place? So the idea behind Museum Exchange is exactly that, trying to find other options when perhaps your local museum isn't your best option for donation.
So is that how you 2 met? Because you were both on different sides of the country?
Yeah, we met through our other co-founder, David Mose, and he and I had known each other sort of in curatorial circles, and we co-organized an exhibition on the Canadian artist Ian Baxter, and Robert was our research assistant for that project. So that's how we all 3 of us directly worked together before coming together on Museum Exchange.
So the 3 of you got together, and how did the exchange initially evolve? Did you have investors, or were you working out on your own? You're all in the arts and not necessarily have computer backgrounds. This has become a digital platform. So how did that happen?
So I can take that one. I was working with David Mose, our other co-founder at the time, and we had a art advisory based in Canada called David Mose Art Advisory. And we were working with a number of collectors to build museum caliber collections. At that time, when the idea came to us to build Museum Exchange, I was discussing with the college roommate who was a serial entrepreneur and a product lead. And he came up with the idea of also helping us on this path. So there were, besides myself, David and Michael, there's some other early co-founders who helped us with the technology and the business side. They're no longer with the business and operational and day to day, but they were instrumental in our early founding. So when we had the concept, we worked it out with that team, a product and tech team. We built the product. And then actually with the Michael got involved was we had a prototype and we were trying to onboard our first 10 museums. And we called Michael at the time, he was the chief curator at the MCA Chicago, to see if he would bring the museum onto the platform. And it was a couple of days later that he returned that we spoke again. And at that point, he said that he was excited to consider this as the opportunity that we want to work with him. So that's how he came involved, and we had the tech platform built up at that moment. But yeah, it's been a lot of learning for us. I'd say like steep learning curve to understand technology and startups. We were initially bootstrapped. The co-founders bootstrapped the business. About 6 months in, we did like a friends and family round. Some early customers came in and really believed in the mission and want to support it. And they came from backgrounds that had been through startups before, understood what it required to build a technology business in today's world. And then about 3 years ago, so about 2 years into the business, we did a angel round, and that was about 10 individuals, all of whom were existing customers of Museum Exchange and major patrons of philanthropists. I really believed in what we were doing and understood how important philanthropy is to cultural institutions today and in the future, and want to support that. So we, since 3 years ago, we've been running off of that investment and are now running the business through our revenue.
And the angels were customers. Talk about your typical customer.
Yeah, I think at the beginning, we thought the ideal or typical customer would be a very active collector who has assembled hundreds, if not thousands, of artworks, and we're thinking about culling that collection, reducing it in size, maybe to save costs on storage, maybe because they were downsizing their homes. We absolutely recognized the generational shift here from baby boomers that were starting to really downsize as they got older and wanted to simplify their lives. So that was our initial customer profile. And for sure, that still remains a big portion of our client base on the donor side, which are people that are just addicted to collecting art and have so much art they don't know what to do with. And again, they probably likely got in touch with their local museum, wherever they might be, and quickly realized it's not so easy to just foist art on museums as a gift, and recognized that we could help them distribute that art around to places where it really could make a difference. If you're in New York and you go to the Whitney Museum with a masterpiece by Alex Katz or Jasper Johns or whoever, they're going to say yes. But if you go to them with a high edition print or maybe a small drawing or something like that, they're probably not going to say yes because they've got so much of that kind of material. And so those are the kinds of, we can go down the food chain, so to speak, of art objects to things that might seem less important to a giant metropolitan museum, where these objects could be super useful to a university art museum somewhere else in the country. So kind of recognizing how useful these objects and how valuable they can be, but just if you can find the right recipient for those pieces. So that's really the idea and the primary customer. However, very quickly, it started expanding to living artists, that especially ones maybe later in their career that are recognizing they've got a mountain of art they've created over their lifetime, and what are they going to do with it. Also, a lot of artists' estates came to us quite early on. Also, a similar situation where the heirs or the executors of these artist estates are sitting on all this material that their artist had created, and their goal is to get that out into the world one way or another. We've been a really good vehicle for those kinds of situations. And then even commercial galleries that are still active today, they have recognized that we have a unique user base on the museum side and provide a really interesting way for us to get their artists in front of museum curators and directors all across the country and put those artists into museum collections, which again burnishes their resumes and their career as they assemble different museum collections that they might be representative. Then, of course, there's also corporations too that, especially you see that with banks that have had art in their different branches, and as banks get swallowed up by bigger banks, they have all this art, and it sometimes is a little bit of a mishmash. And so they're also coming to us to find new homes for these objects that are otherwise sitting in storage. So the donor base has really expanded to a quite broad range of donors.
So you started with 3 people and maybe some tech help, and now you have how many employees?
The team today is 10 people, a combination of full-time and part-time, and that's across curatorial, and Michael leads that team, as well as operations, administration, and technology.
What roles do these people play in the exchange?
Myself and one other colleague, America Solomon, we are really the primary liaisons with museums and building up those relationships, traveling to conferences, going to see them in situ, and finding out what they want and what they need, and then us then using that information to help direct gifts to them. I also am the primary person really developing and maintaining relationships with the donors. So cultivating donors and reaching out to them. Oftentimes places like art fairs are a good way just to be out and about and spontaneous conversations happen with donors. But we've also been getting a lot of just cold calls now that people know who we are and what we do. And then we have 2 other team members who are really doing all the logistics to complete the gifts, all the deeds of gifts, the loan forms, the contemporaneous written acknowledgement that I'm sure you know about, Karen. All of those things just to make sure that these gifts go through, and which includes even coordinating shipping and all of that. So that team is really busy with all the behind the scenes important logistics. And then Robert, of course, oversees all of our operations and legal kind of work. And then we have a couple other folks that are doing a user experience and updating the website so that it continually make really great improvements to the usability of the website. And then we have another colleague who really looks after all of our museum, or rather hospital and university relationships, because we've been donating a lot of work into that healthcare and education space too. So she's an expert in that area, and that's a really growing side of the business these days.
So a donor contacts you and says, "I have a work of art that I would like donated." Let's talk about the process that you go through to place that piece of work of art in some entity, museum, hospital, etc. How does the process work?
Sure. So this happens on a daily basis. And first thing would be for me to really take a look at what the object is. So sending an image and all the necessary relevant information, the artist and the title and the date and the size and the medium, all that. So I have a good sense of what this object is. And if I feel that we have a good chance of finding a match for that, especially leaning on this 5 years of experience that we've been have been doing this, then I would say, okay, let's upload this onto our platform. And either the donor, if they're reasonably computer savvy, can do that themselves, or in some cases, our team might help them do that. Just again, upload that image and then the object information, and it's all very intuitive, and all the fields are built out to accept that information. And then it would get slotted into a quarterly digital catalog. Right now, we're working on a fairly strict quarterly basis where every quarter a brand new catalog of objects is released. And the previous catalog disappears, so there's always only one catalog on the museum side or on the healthcare and education side for them to look at. And only museum people can see those objects in that catalog. The donor is anonymous and at that point too, so there's a lot of discretion on that side. And over the course of that 3-month cycle, we're reaching out to museums and saying, hey, I think you might like this object or this one. And our goal is to drive them to write a short proposal saying why they would like to bring that into their collection. And at the end of the 3-month cycle, those proposals come to the donor and they review them to see who makes the best case. And they also could decide for some reason that they don't like any of the proposals and could reject them. But if they accept a proposal, then that triggers all of the next steps on our side in terms of aligning with the museum's processes, their acquisition meetings, their if they need to have the object in person to approve it or not. So we do all of that work to complete the gift. And once it's approved by the museum and their boards, then we help to issue a deed of gift that's signed by both parties. And then we start to arrange the shipping so that the object can be transported to the museum and is finally completely off the books of the collector or the donor. In our model, the museums or the recipients pay for the shipping costs, although sometimes the donors could get involved in helping with that. And then eventually then the appraisers come in at outside firms. We don't have in-house appraisers, and they would appraise the piece and issue the 82, 83 tax form for the donor. So all of that is handled on the site and is very transparent and visible from both parties. So that's the goal, is that it's just one stop. We can handle all of these different functions that are involved in making an art donation.
And how do you get compensated?
We're paid by the donors. Once we make a successful match that they approve of, that triggers our matchmaking and processing fee. And right now it's just a flat fee, no matter the value of the object, just to avoid any conflict when it comes to valuation and everything. And then the museums also pay us an annual subscription fee once they start to be successful in receiving gifts. They can browse our catalogs for free, but once they start receiving gifts, then we ask them to pay an annual subscription, which is it's tiered to their operating budget. So big museums pay more than little museums.
How many museums do you have in your catalog?
We've got over 400 that are in our network and looking actively at our catalogs these days.
And are they only in the United States, or are any of them outside the United States?
Mostly in the US, and that's primarily because of that most of the donors are looking for a tax deduction. We do have some Canadian museums, and there are reciprocal tax benefits for Americans donating to Canadian institutions and vice versa. And then we have just a small handful of even further international museums that have found out about us and are looking at our catalogs. They usually can only receive gifts when the donor is maybe a foundation or something that doesn't need a tax deduction. And the other reason that we haven't really pursued more of an international museum audience is that the shipping starts to become really exorbitantly expensive once you start shipping outside of continental US. So it's just made more sense to concentrate on American museums. And even the comparison between American and Canadian museums is interesting. This process and this tradition almost of donating is very well established in the US. And even though it's fairly bureaucratic, it's even more bureaucratic and slow moving in Canada. So we haven't even seen as much uptake there as we've seen amongst our American museums.
And what is your placement rate?
On the first try, it's around 60%. And then oftentimes, if a piece doesn't match, we can either move it from the museum catalog to the healthcare and education catalog to give it another audience, if the donor is okay with that, or we just rest the piece for 6 months and then relist it when we have new museums signed on and fresh eyes. And we've had a really high success rate in those sort of second relistings of pieces too. So
How do you decide whether or not a piece would go into the museum catalog or the healthcare and education catalog?
So a lot of times it's based on donor preference. Some donors are really focused on burnishing the reputation and the legacy of the artist. You'd find that especially maybe with an artist's estate or maybe a gallery that's putting something forward. So they are focused on museums as that kind of gold standard of respectability in a way. Other people aren't so concerned with that and recognize that hospitals and universities could be another really great use of this object. And then it comes down to the content. So in the hospital and university setting, you're not going to want to have a lot of blood or sex or politics or anything that's too edgy. And likewise, the museums that want the edgier, more kind of cutting edge material. So it's oftentimes it's the content itself that really dictates which catalog makes more sense.
And have placement preferences changed in the 5 years that you've been in existence?
I don't think so. I think they've stayed pretty constant, especially because the hospital and university side is pretty clear in the types of work that they can handle and would like in their spaces. So that still remains pretty constant. And I think maybe just 5 years is too small of a sample to see any kind of major change in the tastes of museums. That's still been pretty constant too. I think we're still very much in a period where museums are recognizing that their collections are primarily made up of white male artists, and they're very interested in diversifying that and being able to tell broader stories. Bringing artists into their collections, artists of color, artists from different backgrounds, is still very much a part of the collecting strategies of a lot of the museums that we work with.
Describe your typical donor.
So I would say somebody maybe that's in their 70s, mid to late 70s, maybe even into their 80s, who's been collecting for 40 years and has multiple houses and art spread all over those houses, and is starting to realize, okay, this is a big burden to own all this property and have all this artwork, and I want to downsize to a condo in Miami. So what am I going to do with all this art? And my kids have said they don't want it. They think it's crazy that I've been buying all this stuff. My local museum only wants a few things. They've kind of cherry picked the collection. Then I've got these 100 other objects here that I need to figure out what to do with. And I'm already consider myself a good steward of the art. And so I don't want to just take it down to the Salvation Army. And also there's value here where I could perhaps get a tax deduction for these objects. I would say kind of that's the kind of quintessential client that we have these days. And again, both from an age demographic and from a behavioral demographic, where collecting has become part of their life and they've just amassed all of these objects over the years. And now the chickens are coming home to roost.
Have you ever turned a donor down?
Oh, yeah, we turn people down all the time. It's primarily when the artwork is just not of the caliber that we think either the museums or the hospitals or the universities would want, or there's things that are questionable provenance, like maybe you can imagine a Salvador Dali print that was bought on a cruise ship or something like that, raises some red flags from the beginning. And then, of course, there's pieces that the condition has to be good on these objects. Museums are not interested in taking on projects that they need to conserve and spend money on. There's just too many of those already in their storage rooms. So condition becomes a really big issue for us too in determining what we take on and what we don't. Somebody told me once that one of the most important things to learn as a curator is learning how to say no, which is primarily to donors and things like that. And I think we've really had to learn how to do that with this business, to let people down gently when we really don't think that we have a good rate of success with this particular object or group of objects that they brought to us.
Which leads me to the question of, what do collectors most often misunderstand about how a museum operates?
I think that they just assume that they have unlimited storage space and they'll take anything. If you're a nice, upstanding citizen in that community and you come to their doorstep with some art, the museum's going to say yes. And that's categorically untrue. Most museums turn down most of the things that are offered to them. And the bigger the museum, the higher the rate of rejection, I think.
And do museums often, especially the bigger ones, ask for donations of cash as well?
They can, yes, especially if the gift itself would really create a burden, so to speak, on the museum, where staff time would really be required to process that gift, bring it in, maybe even it would require extra storage space, all of that kind of thing. So sometimes museums are asking for cash gifts, especially when a large group of objects might come into the museum all at once.
So those are kind of the financial issues that tend to arise when a donor contemplates a gift to a museum. Do you see any legal issues other than provenance?
Provenance for sure is an issue. Somebody came to me just the other day with an object that was from the 17th century. And I said, something that old, we really need to know the history of its ownership, especially during and after the World War II period, because museums are not touching anything that has questionable provenance that could have been stolen by the Nazis and then resold under duress, all of that kind of history. It's really complicated and just too much hassle to get involved with anything like that. And then there are other things too, that things that might have come in from Other countries where there are cultural patrimony protections, things like more or less kind of grave robbing kind of scenarios, whether it's in Europe or South America, wherever it might be. So there's a lot of that to navigate. We haven't had too many of those come to us, but there have been a few of those, and those are just situations that require a lot more time and care and due diligence. And then, of course, we haven't had this situation either, but you want to be pretty clear that this person has clear title. And again, they're not donating something that doesn't belong to them. So that's something to keep an ear out for as you're onboarding new clients as well.
So do you have a research team to look into these issues, or do you expect the donor to clear all these roadblocks for you?
Yeah, we've really pushed that responsibility back onto the donors themselves. Also, in cases where maybe a condition might be questioned in some way, having the donor provide a condition report. So that would give any kind of new recipient kind of a peace of mind that this object is in good, stable condition that they can count on for years to come.
Have you come across any banned materials such as ivory and had to turn that kind of stuff down?
I think maybe there might have been some initial conversations about those collections, but they didn't, for some one reason or another, didn't go forward. Maybe the donor just changed their mind, but we haven't really had to dig in or dig our heels in, I should say, even to say, no, we can't take this. We've maybe raised some flags with people as they've brought that kind of material to us in advance, but we haven't really had to formally turn people down or turn that kind of material away.
Okay. I represent a lot of artists. Do you work with artists or other creators of materials and works? And how is that model different from placing a work coming from a collector?
Yeah, we do work with living artists all the time these days. And the primary difference is that we give them a discounted rate for our services because they can't get the same tax deduction that a collector of their work would get. Artists can only deduct the cost of the materials that went into the making of their work. So even if you're Jasper Johns and you have a $10 million painting, it might have only cost you $35 in canvas and stretchers and paint to make that thing. And that's all you could write off. So it's a pretty unfair and long-standing tax provision that people have tried to change for decades and is still sitting there. So we recognize that with artists and have created this discounted price for their donations. And one of the things that we found really exciting about working with living artists, in some cases, like I said earlier, they might be later career artists, even fairly well known with good galleries, but they still have all this material that they want to distribute. And so they can come to us and we can help push their work into museums around the country through donation. We've also had artists that are still quite active that maybe don't have great gallery representation. And so therefore they don't have the same kind of public outlet that other artists with galleries might have. And they've recognized that we can be the conduit to museum curators around the country. And as long as they're able to make an object available for donation, when we put it in front of our museum curators, they can get those objects into museum collections. And so we've had a lot of artists that have built up really impressive lists of museums that they're in their collections of without going through the gallery system and having really strong representation that way. Even smaller commercial galleries don't have museum liaisons on their staff, people that are out there cultivating museum relationships all the time. So galleries have even come to us to serve that role for them and get in front of museums and bring objects to curators around the country that they don't have connections to. So this is really a unique muscle that we've built, is this extensive network of curatorial relationships in museums all around the country. Over, like I said, over 400 museums.
It's a lot of museums. What about artist foundations and estates?
Yeah, it's similar. We also have a discounted rate for them. Oftentimes, they're not seeking tax deductions either. And they also have, in some cases, lots and lots of material that their artists have left behind. There's a wide range of typologies there, from the single heir who has things sitting in a storage unit, down by the freeway to people that artists that were well established and left behind cash and real estate and valuable art. And those estates are well funded to have administrators and other people looking after the legacy of that artist and everything in between. But in all cases, we still have this network of museums that are interested in looking at this work. And I feel like we're at a point where curators are quite open-minded, I think, about looking beyond the power centers of New York and Los Angeles and recognizing talent that maybe has gone unrecognized out there, overlooked by history and the markets and things like that. So it's a moment where a totally unknown artist who has no market presence can still attract the attention of museum curators and go onto the walls of their museums. And we've really proven that case.
Let's talk about some of the smaller museums that you work. Where are they located? What kind of works are they typically looking for?
Yeah, I think it's often easiest just to think about the Midwest because it's overlooked by major media outlets very often. And that's where we've had some incredible successes with museums that wouldn't be on the tip of most people's tongues. Last week, I went to visit the Figge Art Museum in Davenport, Iowa, who has become a real power user of ours. They've received $2.6 million worth of art from us over the years. And when I was touring through their galleries last week, they had probably almost a dozen pieces from Museum Exchange that are hanging on their walls in and amongst other things from their collection. Or even they're participating in a loan program with the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and some Museum Exchange objects are hanging next to pieces that are on loan from the National Gallery even. So that's a really great example. Another really early adopter was the Sheldon Art Museum at the University of Nebraska, who have a beautiful 1964, I think, Philip Johnson design building in perfect condition, an amazing collection. They had a Edward Hopper on loan to the Whitney recently. They've just been collecting for years and years, and they've been adding things to their collection from Museum Exchange, and again, putting these objects into an incredible context that most people have no clue that this is out there in Lincoln, Nebraska. And of course, I was lucky enough to go out there and visit and do a talk. And so I'm learning about these museums as well as our donor community too. And so those are I think, some of the most exciting kind of success stories where it's going outside of the major metropolitan centers.
So you're finding it, I assume, much easier to place works in these smaller museums in the off markets, so to speak.
Yeah, I think the primary reason is they don't have the collector base in those cities that you have elsewhere. So we're a really incredible proposition to them to be delivering them collectors from all across the country to the doorsteps of Davenport, Iowa. And so that's quite unique. And oftentimes these museums, once they are connected with a donor through us, and if the donor is excited about what the museum's doing, they remain involved. And some have joined advisory boards on these museums. So there's a real opportunity for museums to cultivate new patrons through these relationships that we're establishing.
This is a wonderful service that you're offering to improve culture throughout the country. What advice would you give an artist who wants to place his or her work in a museum?
The one thing, of course, is that they have to be willing to donate the work if they want to use us. We primarily work through donations. So they have to be willing to kind of give up that potential sale. So there's a bit of hardship on that in that respect for an artist. The other thing is this is kind of hard for artists sometimes where they're so monofocused on their work and what they're doing and maybe don't always recognize the broader context of why museums put things on the walls that they do. And oftentimes it's really to create conversations with their visitors and spur dialogue. So some artwork is not as well suited to that. It can be a little bit more hermetic or talking just about very specific aesthetic ideas and maybe not about broader cultural or social ideas. And I really find a lot of museums are looking for those kinds of artworks that generate conversations about our time and place. So things that are really esoteric are a harder sell with museums these days. But those are the kind of conversations that I have with artists all the time as they're bringing objects to us, and can coach them through that. Oftentimes, they might send me to their website or bring me a selection of works, and I will kind of help direct them to pieces that I think would be the most successful, kind of thinking of using those some of that criteria as my guides. Not all artwork is meant to be in a museum is the other harsh reality. And again, I try to talk people through that as well as best I can.
Diplomatically,
Yes.
I hope. And what about pledge agreements? Because an artist is not going to get the benefit of a tax deduction, but they could potentially pledge work to be transferred to a museum at death. Do you do any of those?
We definitely have. It's been surprisingly few situations where we've done, and I say that surprisingly few because I used to do them all the time when I was a museum curator and see them all the time, where people would make promised gifts. And so what that does is it establishes a pathway at some point in the future for this object to come into the museum's collection. It doesn't always happen on death. It could just be that someone just wants to own this piece for a little bit longer before they're ready to give it. But it could be upon death, which I guess would really be considered more like a bequest or something like that. We're set up to do that and to handle those conversations, but they haven't been as common as I would have thought. The other thing that we haven't really talked about that might be a very good vehicle for those bequests is that we've helped to start a sister organization, a nonprofit called Charis Foundation for the Art. It also could be a really good vehicle for people to make bequests where the art would go to this foundation after their passing or at the time that they're ready. And then that foundation's job is to then push these objects out into the world, into a museum and other nonprofit collections over time after they've had some time to process the work and study it and contextualize it in some way. So that's another lever that we've developed that hopefully will start really kicking into gear in the next couple years.
Let's talk about that foundation because I don't know anything about it.
I'll let Robert take this one on because he's been the mastermind of this.
Yeah, so I was the incorporator, but through running Museum Exchange for 5 years, we had recognized that a lot of these smaller museums or lesser staffed institutions did not have the resources and the bandwidth to investigate donation opportunities. What that led to was that the larger museums are more active in the platform. They can identify understudied artist or a marginalized minority artist and move into the collection. With Charis, the idea is that they're almost outsourcing a curatorial force. Charis has its own team that can research opportunities, bring works with the collection, provide further scholarship, and then promote that work to other institutions through online exhibitions, loan programs, research publications. And over time, the goal of Charis is to place those works into the other institutions. So whether it's another museum or a university, a hospital, a community center, any other nonprofit in the US could be recipient for an artwork from Charis. And really the idea is to redistribute those artworks to institutions that can benefit from them and give to those communities. So Charis, it's governed by an independent board. It was formed last year. And like Michael said, it's just getting going now. But it's a great possible destination for either a collector who wishes to bequest a gift, bequest it while they're living, but not ready to part with the works yet, or with a large collection that needs some more attention before it can go to the donation market. But those two use cases are really great for Charis donors.
And how could somebody contact Karis?
They can email info@charisarts.org. Michael is the president of Charis, so they will speak with Michael, and there will be a website. It's just coming online now.
And what will that URL be?
It's Charis. Yeah, Charis is spelled Charis, arts.org.
How did you derive that name?
Charis comes from Greek and it means grace, kindness, favor, and creativity. And it actually, in mythology, it's the three graces. So the Greek word charites. And the three graces, as you might know, are the personification of beauty, creativity, and goodness. We thought that was a good source for the spirit of Charis as a foundation.
Sounds wonderful. And it's up and running at this point? Or
It is up and running. Yes, it's up and running. So it's a public charity in the IRS code. And as I said, there's a board that governs it. All gifts are considered by the board per an acquisition policy. and it operates the same as any museum or other nonprofit that can take in art donations for related use. So it's the same as a traditional museum in that sense.
Any restrictions on donations to Charis?
The only restriction, it has a strict criteria of what it accepts, and that is largely modeled after institutions that Museum Exchange has worked with, understanding again what those characteristics are that they will require for a gift to be received. But there's no restrictions in terms of donor intent. It is the works go to Charis, and it will be owned by Charis in their possession for a certain amount of time, and then gifted onwards to another institution or lent to another institution.
And the criteria are?
Largely what Michael discussed with the Museum Exchange clientele. So it has to be good condition, clear provenance and ownership, no issues with attribution or ownership, the standard museum collecting criteria. Because, of course, the ultimate destination will be an institution. Caris has to have the same requirements when it's bringing works into its collection.
Very nice. Any other growth areas that for a museum exchange?
Good question. So over the last 5 years, as Michael was saying, we really focused on serving donors, and our donor base has expanded to include different types of donors. We've also, as we've gotten more involved and developed those relationships, we've identified other ways we can service them. So one growth area is going from purely artworks to other types of related objects. So we'll be expanding into art books very soon. So museums have an art library, or universities have a library. Collectors who wish to give their art can also give their art books, and they will find its way to support and contextualize those donations. So that's a big growth area. And over time, we can expand to other types of cultural objects. We've done some musical instruments, we've done some decorative arts, glass works. So that's an area of growth. An exciting one, and exciting particularly at this moment, is we are expanding from purely donations to other types of transactions with institutions. So one is loans, so other donor to museum loans, as well as museum to museum loans. There's a type of transaction called a bargain sale, which is the IRS name for it, but we prefer partial gift. It's a part gift and part sale. So what we're seeing with a lot of senior donors or collector families is the desire to support and be philanthropic, but also to generate some income for the future generations. And these bargain sales are a really effective way that these families can do that, where the museum will purchase a work for a discounted price, that those funds go to the donor or the owner, and then the discount amount is issued as a tax receipt, as a charitable contribution. So that's a way that some really marquee artworks that are kind of out of the price point of the budget of museums, their acquisition budgets, can actually still find their way into museum collections. And then another big growth area for us is museum to museum deaccessioning. Michael and our other colleague, they mentioned America, were just at a conference in Iowa City for academic museums and galleries. And a big topic there that we were on the panel about was museum deaccessioning. So helping museums deaccession works responsibly to other institutions, not to the market, not to the private sale or to sales, but actually give their works to other museums, hospitals, universities that can use those collections to further their charitable mission. So that's a big growth area, and one that's we're very excited about.
Wonderful. Let's talk about success stories. Any particular placement stands out to either of you?
There's definitely a few. There's one that's been a bit kind of somewhat publicized lately, which is we've been working with the Martin Z. Margulies Foundation and Collection in Miami. He's a massive collector that was one of those pioneers in opening a private museum space where visitors could come and see his collection in Miami. It was in the warehouse district, so he was really a pioneer in that area and is looking to wind things down, and again has amassed a huge collection that's more than one man can handle at this point. And so we've been helping them to distribute gifts of art to museums around the country, and we've done about over 80 gifts, I think, so far. But they've gone to 31 institutions in 21 states. So it's really, again, redistributing this material from this one hub in Miami to museums all across the country. And so they've been really excited about that reach that we've allowed them to create. And of course, they've been bringing very high quality objects to us that our museums really are excited about. So that's been one of the things that's been really fun lately. The reason I mentioned it was publicized is that they took out a full page ad in Artful magazine recently to talk about this giving. So now it's more public. A lot of these relationships we have with donors are quite private and discreet, and oftentimes they might even say gift of an anonymous donor on the credit line. But in this case, they're being quite transparent about that. So that was one that was an ongoing project that's been really exciting for us to work on.
Do you have one?
A highlight for me was about 4 years ago, the leadership team went down to San Diego and we toured the MC San Diego right when they'd reopened the La Jolla campus. And we saw three works on view that had been donated through Museum Exchange. One in particular was an artist, Ethel Fisher, who's now passed, but we've been working with her estate. She was active in the Bay Area, I believe, in the 60s and 70s. Michael will probably know more accurately, and was popular in her time, but really fell to obscurity. And when we walked into the galleries, we saw her work beside Helen Frankenthaler, and it was incredible to see that work contextualized in that way. And then the next gallery, there's a Richard Hunt. The work from our very first catalog was a Richard Hunt 1950s sculpture that was anchoring this gallery about post-war abstraction. And it was really incredible to think about these two very different artists in very different places that found their way to this incredible museum purely through the technology, through the network that we had built, and to see again these two early artists from our own kind of catalog and history being shared with the public. So that was a great case study of an institution and I guess different donor stories as well.
And what was the most significant work of art that you, let's say, did a donation for?
There've definitely been some pieces that are valued over $1 million that have made their way into museums. I saw one at the Figge Museum the other day, but another one that really comes to mind that's another great story is a collector who had commissioned a big sculpture by Nancy Rubens, who does these gigantic pieces. This one had canoes and kayaks and airplane parts, I think, that were all connected by wires into this gigantic kind of mushroom cloud almost. And he had commissioned it for a house in Florida. He was moving away from that house back up to the Northeast and needed to find a place for this piece because he didn't have a space for it anymore. Interestingly, he actually offered this piece to the Whitney Museum and they said, "We don't have space for this. You should talk to Museum Exchange." So that happens as well. And we put it out on our network on one of our catalogs. I think we got about 6 proposals from museums all around the country. And the museum that made the best case was the Rollins Museum in Orlando, Florida. It's part of Rollins College. And it turns out that this man had lived in Orlando before, so he had the sentimental connection to it. They were getting ready to build a brand new building and would put this piece right at the entrance of this brand new building, so it would just have pride of place. And he accepted it, and it would have been a piece that would have been way outside of their price range to go out and purchase, but it just landed in their lap, and now they're working with the artist to reinstall this piece when the new museum opens. And so that one, I think, is going to have a lot of impact for that one gift. I would not have thought that Rollins Museum was where this was going to end up, but it ended up being on the perfect location for this piece. And so that's another one that I think was significant in value and in impact.
Any last words you want to offer?
This is a very small niche of the art world, ecosystem, and we've just been steadily growing it, and it feels like it's a very useful service. And the interesting thing is that we really don't compete with anyone else or step on anyone else's toes. It's a very complementary kind of business that I think we've created, and that is, I think, rare, but also feels good that it's additive rather than somehow antagonistic in some way.
Where do you see Museum Exchange in 10 years?
Great question. I hope and aspire for it to be the trusted software that museums and donors use for all types of charitable transactions. So we would love for it just to be second nature to open up your Museum Exchange interface and learn about new works that are being offered to you from both Museum Exchange donors as well as your existing donor base, and it to be a really essential part of the philanthropy ecosystem and how museums operate.
I want to thank you both for being with us and having this conversation. It was really enlightening. You can learn more about Museum Exchange on their website, which is
www.museumexchange.com.
okay. Thank you both. It was a pleasure having both of you on the legal canvas.
Thank you. It's been enjoyable.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Please be sure to like and subscribe to The Legal Canvas. Join me each month as I welcome a new guest to the show. The Legal Canvas is the estate law podcast for creative minds.